Hello, this is Silas here, and
Stephen Kirschner, nice to see you again.
yeah, we're back here for the series, I think, on food. The previous video was about you are what you eat, and I think my premise or my intention of that conversation was to get into about how you are what you eat, both physically and mentally, since as humans, a lot of what makes us who we are is the things we think, the things we know, and the way we act.
Yeah, exactly.
So the last conversation we had ended and we had talked about doing the series. So this is part two, and I guess you don't really have to have watched the first one, but we might refer to some of those. But it's going to be more.
It's recommended that you watch the first one.
Okay. So yeah, you are what you eat. So this series also, this I guess this meal will be more enjoyable if you've had the first course of it as well. I guess you could kind of put it that way.
You put it that way, sure.
And we had kind of discussed at the end of that we're going to go into automation and how culture affects food and vice versa. I think there's a big relation between why certain cultures and certain people develop food, and not just the foods they eat, but the level of cuisine. Why is it some people still have very advanced cuisines where you go to their restaurants and there's tons of options, and then why you go to some places and it's pretty much, I don't know what to say, plain, but
Basic.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, basic is not necessarily a negative term. Yeah, so yes, basic fare.
Less developed.
Yeah. Okay, so where are we gonna start? Where are we gonna start?
Well, I think I had touched on this briefly last time, but I was talking a bit about how the reason things like TV dinners and whatever had become so prevalent was because it had to do with a lot with women going into the labor force, and because of that, you needed things that could be made quickly. Whereas 60 plus years ago, if a woman stayed at home, she would start the meal maybe early afternoon and get it going by the time, so it would be ready in time for dinner when the husband ate after work or whatever. But then when women started going into the labor force, then it was, well, we need things that are sped up so that somebody can just throw something in the microwave or in the oven for a few minutes, whatever, and eat it right away. So it was partially out of convenience, and I think I mentioned this last time too, but like I kind of had mixed feelings on that because like on the one hand, it made things more convenient, but at the same time, it led to a lot of people taking shortcuts as well. So that it's, oh, I don't feel like cooking something from scratch. I'm just gonna throw something in the microwave or whatever, and it's just like you lose sort of the art, you lose the quality, you lose the attention to detail. But at the same time, if you have two spouses that are working all the time, you don't have the time to make an advanced meal every night either. So.
So something like this, now I'm wondering how much is this due to the culture? Because I'm guessing we're talking about this in the United States of
Yeah,
America.
that's mainly Western world more broadly, but I was thinking America more specifically.
Because even if we go Western world, I would wonder if this is something that would happen in a place like Italy. From my experience with Italian cuisine, even if you go there on vacations, people who might have vacationed there, or if you've lived there, or if you just study the area, there was a notable thing that they don't really they don't really put as much, I think, it's working hours as Americans do. There was this general thing where the lunch break, the siesta, was like a 2 to 3 hour lunch break where they'd kind of just they would go home and have full meals. They'd go home and eat. It wasn't a thing where they're carrying sandwiches to work. Definitely not carrying TV dinners and throwing something in a microwave at the office. It's normally you actually go to a restaurant or you go home and you actually eat a full meal. And another thing was the dinners. Italian dinners used to be this, I mean, the full proprio Italiano dinners used to be the proper Italian dinners used to be, you sit there and you have a multi-course meal where they bring out
Antipasta, pasta, carne, all that, yeah.
So essentially, yeah, not Olive Garden. I mean, not Olive. I'm not saying like Olive Garden isn't Italian, but it's this odd seeing places are like, yeah, Olive Garden is proper Italian food. So there's an Americanization of certain things, and I think that's where it goes into the automation. It goes into the culture. How do some cultures affect the foods? You're technically eating the same food. It's the same pasta. It's the same meatballs, but the culture, I think, has something to do with how you eat that. Like as we said, if Olive Garden was to adopt a proper Italian style of meals, your average meal would take about 3 hours because they would bring each section out by itself. The salad comes out by itself, no breadsticks on the side. The bread comes by itself. normally even the pasta will come separately, and then after the pasta is gone, they'll have like the carne part, the meat part of the meal. So what is it about certain cultures that do that, and what is it about certain cultures that feel it's not that important to have somebody cooking by hand? Let's just have a microwave dinner and have people at work.
Well, I'd sort of mentioned this a little bit before we started this video, but I was thinking of per se. For those that don't know, I mean, those who are in the industry or know me, of course, are going to know what per se is. But per se is, it's been the top restaurant in New York for a number of probably about a decade or so. It's kind of going back and forth with like one or two others, but it's definitely been in the top three, I would say. But when you go to eat there, you actually have a 20-course meal. And now, obviously, each course is like a few bites. It's not huge. But the point is, it's not like you rush in, you eat, you're out. No, you sit down for multiple hours. But the thing is, from what I hear, that restaurant isn't doing as well in recent times because part of the issue is the price. I mean, the tasting menu is $300-something now, one, and also, and that doesn't, you figure that doesn't include wine and everything. So of course, you add that on, you're spending, several hundred. But the other issue as well is that people just don't want to sit down for that long. Like even people who have that money, they may do that like once every few months, but that's it. Like it's not like where I work or other places where, okay, every Friday somebody comes in. It's just people, like even if you have the money, it's just like you don't want to sit down for that long. And it's supposed to be an experience once in a while, not a regular thing.
And with per se, what kind of cuisine? Is it a mix of different things?
So it's French influence. I mean, Thomas Keller worked in France. He's a self-identified Francophile, but at the same time, it's like, people throw around the term New American a lot, which is really basically, okay, you take some of those techniques, but you try to use more local ingredients. Of course, the menu is a multitude of things. We could actually provide a link where Anthony Bourdain went with with three other guys to the French Laundry. That's Keller's other restaurant in California. That was his original flagship, and it was pretty cool. It was three guys. It was Eric Ripert, the chef of Le Bernardin. That's another top place in New York. Michael Ruhlman, a food writer, and a former chef of Veritas, which is another higher end place in the city. And each guy got a separate 20 courses, which you think about it, it's like, that's 80 courses in total, and they all like shared. So they had, it was really cool. Well, again, we'll send the link to it, but it's like, they all had, different pastas, different sorbets, like a multitude of desserts, different meat and fish dishes. It's really amazing. Just like think of, I couldn't even think of a fraction of those in general, but just 80 high-end courses. It's like, the amount of creativity and ingenuity to come up with that.
So this is one thing I've been talking about, getting back to the whole idea that you are what you eat, both physically and mentally. Yeah. And the different kind of choices that people take on what they eat and the process they do and the quality over quantity. Where in some of these cases we're talking about, yes, the time or the cost of these might be exorbitant for a single meal. But when you think about it sometimes, if you decide to maybe save your time, let's say you're doing physically, you decide, okay, I'm going to save my time, I'm going to just eat maybe just something simple as eggs and something basic for multiple days.
Sure.
It's good to eat eggs. And eventually you save up. Eventually you save up, and then you can actually afford to go to this higher-end restaurant for one day.
Right.
And I was thinking the same thing in information. People say, okay, it's very easy to find just your basic information. You go out and you just see really low quality information, and people are gorging themselves in that low quality information. And they say, okay, it's harder to go on YouTube, for example, and listen to like a 1 hour video. Like this video is probably going to be.
People that we listen to in general.
Yeah, people say, okay, it's going to be harder to actually listen to that, but they say I don't have the time. But they'll find time to listen to smaller, I don't say junk information, but smaller bits of information, these little clips here and there. Whereas if you were spending that time and you chose, okay, instead of listening to these small clips over and over, let me actually take that time and allot it for this bigger thing. So talking about the cost, why is it for some people they're able to save in that way, and why do some people feel the need that, okay, this is actually a worthwhile purchase to spend my money, like $100 on this one meal, versus them being comfortable to spend $15 on 5 days, so technically spending more, for a meal that's not necessarily that much better quality when you add the $15 that was spent there.
Well, I think, I mean, if you, let's say, per se versus another restaurant, you think about it, it's you're paying for the craftsmanship, you're paying for the technique, you're paying for the attention to detail, etc. Like, I think to a degree, it's the whole Austrian economics, subjective value theory and all that. Like, for example, an analogy I would make is that I've made this analogy to a few people because I have some friends who are big car enthusiasts, but I don't know much about cars myself. Like, if I had a ton of money, I could afford a Ferrari, but the thing is, would it be worth it to me? I wouldn't get as much out of it as one of my car buff friends because they know more about the gears, the handling, how the car is built, the attention to detail. I actually saw a documentary on Ferraris being made. It was really interesting how they scan the sheets on the outside and look for even like a micron off in the surface. Like, there's that much attention to detail. So, like, some of it I kind of get, but the point is because I don't know enough about that subject, I feel like it's kind of lost on me. And I think with food, it's the same thing. Like, for me, if I had the money, I might eat it per se maybe once or something, but I appreciate the attention to detail, the different flavors, the flavor pairings, the presentations, the techniques, but because I have the background in that, I have more of a sense of appreciation for it. Whereas the average person on the street who doesn't really follow food that closely, to them it's just, oh, this is just an expensive meal.
Yeah, look, that goes with the knowledge of the food, of information, of what you consume.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's a general thing about how people think they know something and they don't quite know what it is. I just had a video on how do we get to know what we're doing? How do we know this is good food? How do we know this is good wine? I know a lot of people do the whole like the shake thing. They put their nose in there. I'm going to admit I have no really clue to tell. I can tell, I think, what's bad wine, but I can't really tell like the values of the better wines. I think there was only one time ever somebody gave me some wine and was like, okay, I could tell this was a really higher quality that I put aside from other wines that I was assured were good quality as well. But talking about this, how do you think people approach food? Like we were talking about before, how they have the general food culture, the celebrity chef culture, things like Iron Chef became really big. There's all these food competitions everywhere. Now you have this burgeoning industry of food buffs. You have things like Yelp where people go on there, and Yelp is
self-proclaimed critics and all.
For you don't know, Yelp is just a site where it aggregates. It's not an aggregator, but it just lists different restaurants and locations, and people go there and give reviews, and then you have star levels. People, if you give enough reviews, you get a higher star rating. So, and restaurants actually got to the point where a restaurant could sink or swim according to the right amount of Yelpers. So they get a form of control, and then people start feeling like, yes, we're experts about this. And what are your general thoughts about the effect that's had on the food industry?
See, I don't know. I mean, I kind of have mixed feelings on it because, like, on the one hand, it's good that people are more into food and they're learning more and so on. I think that's a plus. But I think the problem is, like with a lot of things, and you see this a lot with college students today, where they learn, and I admit I've been guilty of this too, where you learn a little bit and you think you know everything. Like I like this happened at CIA a lot, the Culinary Institute of America, for those that don't know, where like you learn a few things about food and you all of a sudden get so proud of yourself, but it's like there's always some higher level to reach. I mean, you're a culinary student, what do you know? I mean, you're not an actual chef yet. I mean, you haven't worked in the industry that much. There are how many chefs above you, and then of course, the top chefs are above them, and it's just like, what are you in the grander scheme of things? So it's like, I just think you have to keep being in that environment where you're constantly being challenged and you're constantly pushing yourself to learn more stuff. Like, for me, like, like I obviously, people who follow me on Facebook, whatever, know I love debating politics with people, but like I try to talk to people who will disagree with me but know more than I do, because then it's like that's how you strengthen your belief system by having strong challenges thrown your way. It gets you to re-examine things and so on. And I think with food it's kind of the same thing. Like, people have to look into how this food is made. If you're working in the restaurants, of course you have to work in a more challenging restaurant because that's how you build your skill base. And it's like, I think you just have to keep pushing for that next tier and work under people who will push you to that next tier as well, because you eat out a lot, that doesn't mean anything. You're not an expert on food based on that. I mean, a lot of people eat out a lot. That's why I think it's ridiculous, these Yelpers. The South Park did an episode about that too. I don't know if you saw, where, well, they basically made fun of that, where Cartman and the other characters were going around writing reviews of places, and the places were bending over backwards for them because they were scared of how it would hurt their reputation. But it's the same thing. It's like, oh, we eat out a lot, we know a lot about food, and it's like, you don't really, and it's also like, you haven't worked in a kitchen, you don't understand the mechanics of, okay, how does a kitchen work? How long does it take to prepare this dish? How do you prepare this dish while you have other things going on? Like, it's not like anyone can just walk back there and do it. There's a real challenge behind it. I mean, per se, it's like you have all these dishes, they have to be perfect. If you send out burnt food, you could lose one of your Michelin stars. Michelin only goes 1 through 3, and then it's like you have to work really hard to get that back, and it's not like anyone can just walk back there and do that, And I think to an extent that's just ignorance. People don't know what goes into it,
So there is this argument that you see in a lot of places where they say, okay, if this person hasn't done X, they can't talk about X.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily completely on board with that, because in some cases I think a good example I think people always give is in sportscasting. Right now there's a big movement of there's equality movements being done across the board in all sorts of things. We need equal representation of these opinions and minds. But in some cases, I don't think you need equal representation. If I go to a doctor and I have something maybe wrong with my arm, I don't need equal representation of dentists and dermatologists or skin doctors or gynecologists. If something is wrong with my arm, I don't need a full spectrum of doctors that work on different parts of the body. I need an arm specialist. So how would you think, what kind of things do you think are taken for somebody to really become specialized or have a good input into judging what food is, just taste-wise? Let's not talk about the nutrition aspect of it, but just what is good food? What's a good taste of food? Besides, of course, there's a biological aspect of some people have better palates than others.
Right.
But yeah, what would you say?
Well, you mentioned wine and stuff earlier, which is actually good because I'm a pretty big wine enthusiast. And for that, a lot of it is being able to detect the overtones. Like, in general, this is very broad, obviously. A sommelier could watch this and correct me over and over. But in general, New World wine tends to be fruitier. Old World wine tends to be earthier. For example, you get a Pinot Noir from the Northwest United States, it'll smell more like cherries. But if you get one from France, it might smell like black olives or like black pepper. Mm-hmm. So, and that has to do with the terroir, the climate, the soil, all those various factors. And the talent with the sommeliers is able to match that with food. For example, comparing and contrasting. For example, a Syrah from France might have a black pepper overtone, so that pairs well with steak au poivre because that's a steak and pepper dish. But then, another sommelier might contrast flavors. Like, they might say, okay, this fish is a little leaner. Let's have a wine that's a little stronger. And there's something that's called the Tower of Power that he taught us in school, where conventional wisdom is red wine with red meat, white wine with a fish and chicken. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that actually intersects too. Like, you can have a stronger white with a lighter red meat, or you can have a lighter red with some fish. For example, halibut is commonly paired with red wine because it's a heavier fish. So things like that. And then it gets into a whole debate about, do you want to compare, do you want to contrast? Usually when I go out to eat, I'll ask my server or bartender or whoever, I'll say, what would you recommend? And then they kind of explain, okay, this is from France, it has high mineral content. I think it would go well with that fish because it's leaner. I think it would go well with the oysters. There's usually some, reasoning behind it. And obviously it's subjective taste too, but there's usually some sort of reasoning why that wine would pair better with that food. And then, of course, the sommeliers are able to pick up, they're more advanced as far as they can pick up, a certain French wine and they can say it's from this region, it's from this chateau within this region, and so on. Whereas, of course, to me, I might be able to broadly tell, okay, this is, Northwestern Pinot Noir, but I won't be able to tell, oh, it's from this part of California versus this part of Oregon. Yeah.
Now, in that sense, would that be more something off of experience, or are there certain courses or certain ways that you think somebody can tell, or do people have certain probably affinities to these things? Or
I think it's to a certain degree it's natural senses as far as sense of smell and all, but I also think it's just education and knowing, okay, if it's from this area, it's going to be fruity, or if it's from this area, it's going to be drier. if the Chardonnay is a little more yellow in color and has like sort of a buttery overtone, it was aged in oak. If it's more acidic, it was aged in a steel cask. Things like that. Like some of that stuff can be learned. Like with wine, I would say I know more than the average person, but I can't compete at all with the sommelier. I mean, they're very well versed, and of course, you have master sommeliers who are at that really advanced level. Like I think I have to look up the number, but I think there are like under 100 of them in the world or something.
And now that we have over 100 of them in the world, but we also have these supercomputers that we walk around. You mean these same things that you walk around with, and you have your average Yelpers there doing this. Now they have, I think, apps and things like that. Now I've seen a few apps where they have wine lists where you can have wine brought to your house, or you can have select wine. So I'm imagining we can get to a position where you can have just those 100 sommeliers sit at whatever restaurant they have or home they're at, and just have just constant chat room coming in of different people asking for different wines. So at the same, and then you can have these 100 people service hundreds of thousands of people by just using these communication systems. So this goes back to that outsourcing, that automation of certain things. The same way where it's not necessarily exactly the same as a microwave dinner, but you're just like, okay, I don't know how to make this meatloaf. So instead of making this meatloaf, learning how to make this meatloaf, spending the 40 hours a week it takes to make meatloaf every night, I can just buy this little thing from the store, throw it into the microwave for 5 minutes and get that.
Right.
So you get to a point where instead of learning how to know about wine, instead of doing this, people are already now going to Yelp and doing that. Now when they're at Yelp, somebody else might develop a system now instead of the Yelpers. Let's find a way to get these top sommeliers. I'm saying that right?
Sommelier,
yeah, and into have those come out, then that can also now undo what the Yelpers are doing. So with this, I think there's a changing environment as we've talked about with actual restaurants. How do restaurants find the clientele? And I think restaurants in general, even before the technology, before this, they're not really that steady of a business, are they?
No.
Like,
I mean, I've even said, like, I've lived in Hell's Kitchen for almost 8 years now. The restaurants, even in my immediate neighborhood, have changed a few times. There are one or two on my street that's like, okay, those have been there, but then there are a number of around where even in that same location, there were a few different places.
Yeah. And with the margins, I mean, I think this is a general thing with businesses, very short margins.
Yeah.
But in restaurants, it's one of the most razor thin ones.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
I think the average is 3 years for a restaurant to be open.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? 90% of small businesses fail within a year, and then it's like with restaurants. I mean, again, I haven't followed everything, but I mean, I've worked in a place that is now closed. I've seen a bunch of places in my area. I know places that my friends have worked at that aren't there anymore, etc. Because it's just, like you say, the slim margins. I mean, you're handling perishable goods. You have a lot of staff coming and going. Of course, the business is pretty sporadic. Like, even where I work, typically weekends are busier, but in the summer weekends are slow. And then we've been busy early in the week, which is odd. But it's like you can't control those things because then that's people's tastes, the restaurant's reputation, how well are you advertising? What is the price point? Is it somewhere people can eat regularly? Oh, like all those various factors, Yeah. So it's not, I think a lot of people have this notion that like, oh, you open a restaurant, you're sitting on a gold mine. And it's like, that's not the case at all.
Yeah, people got to eat, but
there's a lot of places to eat. Yeah.
I mean, what they eat is up to the question. So now let's get a little bit into the automation, into the quality of the food that comes from automation. As automation improves, the food quality is going to improve. And then what do you even consider automation? Because some people there's people who say artisanal. Is that the term? Artisanal, or they say that artisanal preparation for actual things. When they say that this artisanal thing, it goes, I think, beyond organic, and that's when someone is saying, this is butter that's actually been hand churned and things like that. So even a simple thing like, instead of, you can argue that if somebody isn't out there using their physical strength to cut down the wheat and using a cow with a plow, that's automated in a way. Yeah. So why are you going to argue that process isn't automated because somebody's whipping a cow with a plow behind it, versus now if it's a robot or if it's a machine that, let's say you had a future tractor that just goes there, gets churns the wheat up, separates it, and as it's going, it's using solar panels to like bake maybe all the ingredients. It's using solar panels to somehow bake the the wheat that's created there, and as the machine is going, the fumes that are coming out from the solar powered oven also causing steam to power the motor. So you have an entirely automated thing where this machine is just going around these massive fields, just creating bread on site in this process. Someone would say, okay, that is too automated for bread, but they'll claim that it's artisanal if somebody has used a cow. So what's...
Well, see, I think I made this point in the last video, but I was talking about how, like, you know, there's that old exercise, they say how you could end unemployment if you get rid of farming equipment, do everything by hand, but okay, but then what happens to the price of food if you're paying all these people? Like, we used to have a country where it was like 92% or something worked in agriculture, now it's less than 3%. But because you have tractors, because you have fertilizers, you have, you know, planes that can fly, you know, the pesticides over, all that, you know, you don't have to spend all that time in the field picking that. Yeah, you put people out of work, but at the same time, okay, if the cost of food plummets, well, now you can feed everybody and we can focus on other things. So I think it's really a misconception. Like, for example, you could still have, like, I think I brought this up last time too, about how, like, you can buy vegetables that are pre-cut a certain way, but it's like you still need someone to create a dish. Like, a dish is not going to create itself on its own. I mean, I don't know, maybe you could argue in the future that there's going to be AI that will come up with dishes or something, but we're not there yet. I mean, you still need that person to sit there and figure out, okay, how do I want this to seasoned, how do I want this cooked, what, you know, so you still need that creative aspect. But if you can eliminate a lot of those tedious tasks, you can drive down the price. And I think it would be more fun too, because then you can just focus on those creative aspects rather than manual labor.
So creative aspects in what sense?
Like, as far as, you know, how do you want it seasoned? How do you want something cooked? How do you want the presentation? All that.
Okay. And now with this joke they normally go about with, I think I might put up a meme of this. They have this thing of, like, black people, black Americans, and white Americans saying, like, white Americans never season the chicken.
Yeah.
And, okay, when it comes to presentation, how much do you feel presentation actually enhances a meal? Because for me, I like cooking, but my presentation isn't always tip top because I'm like, okay, the food is the food. And just going back to this thing in a kid, like, you know, they say, oh, things are put separate on the plate, but it's going to mix up anyway when you eat it. Yeah. I do get that there's taste bud things, there are differences, but I'll often do a situation, for example, if I'm doing something with, like, rice and meats and rice and protein and carbs or something on the side.
Right.
I'll normally cook them separately, but eventually when they get on the plate, I'll just mix them up all together and eat them. Like, more like a ramen type situation where everything's together. So how much do you think presentation plays a part in the actual enjoyment or taking in of the food? Because I definitely do think it does play a huge part, a massive part, when it comes to just information.
Well, I think it also depends what level. I mean, I go to, you know, a diner, I'm not going to expect some ultra neat thing, but if I go to a higher end restaurant, obviously I will. But for me, I think it also depends on your sense of appreciation for art, your sense of appreciation for the technique, and so on. Like, I remember I showed some of my older relatives the French Laundry cookbook, that's Thomas Keller's original place, and they saw the quenelle of ice cream. And for those that don't know, quenelle is kind of like this egg-shaped scoop. And I think my grandfather's just like, what the hell is that? It's a funny looking thing. But that's the thing, you don't know. But then if you work in a kitchen, you know. I actually got fairly good at quenelling, but you know it takes a certain technique to do that. And there's a certain order on the plate and so on. And colors as well. But again, it also depends on your appreciation for art. Like, Silas is far more artistic than I am. For me, I appreciate art a lot. I'm not good at creating it, but, like, I really appreciate the attention to detail and so on. So I think that factors into it as well. And I think that relates to what I was saying earlier about cars. Like, if you don't have that sense of understanding, to you it's just, okay, these are just shapes on a plate. But if you worked in a kitchen, if you know what goes into it, it's like, wow, look at that attention to detail. Look at all the vegetables that are cut to the exact same size. Look at how evenly everything is cooked. Like that, you know, that there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of effort in that. It's not, you know, it's not something anyone can just throw together.
Yeah. All right. With that, there's the attention to detail, the level, the skill, the technique. I think there's something that goes with that in also with places like fast food. People think, okay, fast food itself isn't necessarily, for a lot of people, that isn't really considered something. It's fast food. It's something considered a very basic, just average level of food. But I think one thing that I find kind of worth noting for fast food is the way they've automated that process to the point where you go to a McDonald's across the world and it's normally the same kind of presentation. And okay, it might be a regional thing where it's like in America it's one way, in Italy it's one way. But that way of having the same taste, the same general taste, the same general look, the same general presentation produced by people all across the world in different places. And the people who are going there, you know what you want. You if you feel like a Big Mac, you're not going to go to a restaurant and buy that Big Mac and it's not going to taste like a Big Mac.
Yeah.
Yet, if you just feel like a burger, you could go to many high-end restaurants and just order the basic burger off of there. But depending on how they've cooked that burger, it could be a whole different taste.
Well, you know, it's funny. I actually had a nutrition teacher in school talked about going to Thailand, and she was saying how cool it was to go to McDonald's, and she's like, fries and Diet Coke tasted exactly the same. Yeah. And like that's in a way that's kind of cool, but it also like it's in a way it's cool that that's available, but at the same time it's like you do lose that individualism and so on. But again, it depends what you're looking for, because that's a standard rule they always teach you in restaurants about consistency. It's important. The only exception to consistency is when you do better than previously. But the idea is that, okay, people enjoy a certain dish, whatever, they come back and keep ordering it. Like, there's a certain woman who comes into my job, we know exactly what she orders, but she gets it every time. But she gets it because it's good and the consistency is there. So that's how they keep coming back. Whereas, okay, if you get it a second or third time and it's not that good, you're going to be hesitant about getting it again. And then if you have a few times, it's not good, you're just going to say no altogether. I think David Friedman taught me this. It's called the discipline of constant dealings. It's just you have a business relationship with somebody, you expect a certain quality, a certain price, whatever, and as soon as that starts to deviate, it's do I want to continue this business relationship? Mm-hmm. And I think with restaurants, it's definitely the case. The regulars expect the meal to be just as good or better. Otherwise, it's why am I going to keep coming here?
Yeah.
So.
Now, you see this in food where people are like, okay, we're going to go for something familiar. And I think in general, people might not necessarily complain so much that, oh, we're going to McDonald's or we're going to these restaurants, we're going to these places where somebody else is handling our food, somebody else is handling how it's prepared, the standards of it. They expect to eat the same kind of food over and over again. Or even personally, they'll be like, okay, I like this restaurant. I'm not going to try a different restaurant. It's serving my needs, whatever those needs may be.
Right.
They'll take that and accept that in one way. But now when it comes to information, I think there's a lot of questions recently about now who's controlling the information, who's giving you that information, who's saying what is good information. Why do certain people just constantly go to the same sources and take those same sources in? So what do you think is driving this? I think
with food or with politics?
With politics specifically, a disconnect there where some people seem to understand and even live by that, where they just go to the same physical food, the same restaurants, the same types of foods day after day. People realize that certain cultures, certain people, like let's say the Mexican culture. Yeah. And okay,
that could be broken up.
Yeah, that could be broken up to different things. So let's say specifically, like if you go to Chinatown, in America, just down in New York, go a couple of blocks down, not a couple of blocks, but multiple blocks
this
down.
Side of the city a bit down.
That's right. So you don't know where we are, but yes, that's it.
Yeah.
Down. You go to Chinatown, and people there, you don't go there and expect to see new Mexican restaurants popping up.
Yeah, exactly.
You understand that the Chinese people are going to, whoever's in that area, for some reason, will be eating Chinese food. When you go to the little stores out there, it's different kinds of food, it's different kinds of things that are typical of Chinese people. Mm-hmm. And you understand this is the food they eat, this is the food they're comfortable with, this is what they go to. You never really question why they haven't just opened a new Mexican, Lebanese fusion restaurant.
Yeah.
But at the same point, people think idea-wise, culture-wise, politics-wise, information-wise, that these lines also can't form in these cultural type of ways where it's like, for some reason, these people are going to be predisposed or more comfortable and choose to just stay within this limited group.
Well, why do you think people feel? You're asking why do you think people feel inclined to stay in that, or
why don't people really see that there is a possibility that these things are connected? The same way people grow up into an environment where they prefer certain food, or even if you want to argue that there's biological reasons why this is more preference or more healthy to them, that could also tie in the kind of information that they choose to consume and create.
Well, I think, like you say, how they were raised, I think it's how much they think for themselves and they're willing to question it. Like, for example, I often make the point to people that my parents' political views are actually the opposite. Like, I mean, there probably is some overlap in some areas, but in general, they're very different. But for me, that was beneficial because I heard things from different sides, so like it got me to sort of weigh different things in my own head. Whereas I know a number of people whose parents are basically, their views are basically identical, so they just grow up with that and then they base off that entirely. And then of course you have people who want to rebel, so they go against whatever their parents believe. So, you know, and again, I think that has to do with like, okay, relationships with your parents, like how much do you, what do you think for yourself? You know, I mean, I think there are a lot of factors that go into that. And, you know, I think it's just like, it's also how much you're willing to get out of your comfort zone. Like for me, I'm a very adventurous eater. My father's like that. I guess I get that, you know, more from him. But then I have other family members that won't touch anything that's, you know, slightly out of the ordinary. So, but for me, I see it as like, oh, it's an opportunity to try something. If I don't like it, okay, I don't eat it again. Like, yeah, I had some durian items. Durian, for those that don't know, it's this tropical fruit. The smell has been compared to a dead animal. I've tried that a few times. Just, you know, I wasn't too crazy about it. It was a friend described it as kind of like a cross between mango and onion. It's pretty accurate. But at the same time, you know, I was like, okay, I'll try it, see how it is. I don't like it, fine, that's it. But the thing is, there are some people who will say like, oh, they see taro, like, you know, it's this purple plant inside, and they see a dessert that's like blue, and they're like, oh, I'm not touching that, that looks weird. But then I'm like, if you try it, it's similar to jicama, it's similar to another root vegetable, but to them it's just, oh, this is weird, I won't touch it. Whereas to me, oh, this is kind of interesting, let me try it. So I mean, again, I don't know if that's genetic, I don't know if that's cultural, I don't know if that's just independent thinking. Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what goes into that decision, but
yeah. No, I'm trying to think of how much the presentation now plays a part in that. At least definitely with information and food. I mean, people have a certain thing where you feel hungry, then you're like, okay, there is also something comforting about going to a restaurant that's familiar, the sounds are familiar, the smells are familiar. And I think the same thing kind of applies to information where, you know, there's this question about how do you repackage something for somebody new. If you feel this is some information that they should learn, how do you package it? If you're running a restaurant, if you feel this is food that people should, if you want to take that chance and break it to something new, how do you present your food to those people? How do you get people to come in?
Well, I think it's how you present it. I mean, I think with something like per se, it did so well because the French Laundry was already very successful, but it was just bringing a higher end French kind of experience to the U.S. because the standards there are so high. Like they said that like restaurants that get like 3 Michelin stars here would get like 2 there. Like I knew a guy who he's Austrian. He worked at Choudrée, which is a top place in Austria, and he talked about how I saw a picture of it online. Beautiful place. Like it's along a river. There's these lights and stuff. The service, they have like cigar service. They'll wheel you out a cart with like light it up for you. There's petit four. Petit four is what you get after the dessert. There's a cart that has those. Dessert cart, all that. But there's just like all this attention to detail and so on. And I think when someone like Keller opened his place, it really brought that to the U.S. and it just raised the bar for like, okay, what can we do with food now? What's the next thing to strive for? And I think that inspired a lot of people to develop. I helped out at a competition in school actually, and this German chef, I forget his name, but he's actually a certified master chef, and he said to us, he goes, you guys are a lot better than I was at your age, which shows how far the industry has progressed. And it's because people have kept raising that bar for what's expected, and because of that drives that competition. They're like, okay, how do we get better? How do we get better? How do we become the next big thing?
Yeah, because I was just thinking about that with just in general. If you have the same amount of money to just have the basic kind of Chinese food, and every day you just go to the same Chinese restaurant and order the same thing. I know for me, my go-to is General Tso's chicken every time I go to a Chinese place. And that tastes somewhat different in different places, and it turns out it's not even Chinese. It was actually invented somewhere here in New York, but it's just considered part of Chinese food, which maybe that's part of why I like it so much, because it's not as Chinese as some of the other Chinese stuff, but we can get into that later. But just the aspect that you could do that, yet you could also spend that same $10 to $15 and try a different restaurant, a different type of cuisine or restaurant over and over again. So I think what I'm trying to get at is, with these top levels of things like the per se's, even where you're working right now with Meta, where they have people will go to an all you can eat Japanese sushi place and have that maybe you pay about $20 to $25.
Yeah, and you get a lot of
places like that. And you get a lot of sushi, but it might not be the most quality stuff. Like I don't know if we had discussed that, but I saw an article talking about how sometimes they switch out different fish. Like you order a certain fish and it's actually not really that fish.
Yeah.
They'll actually use basic local fish in substitute for the foreign fish. I think you had posted something like that. Not quite sure.
Yeah, it's also, I know the quality. Well, the other thing with a lot of those places, the quality is bad. Like, for example, where I work, they bring the fish in whole, break them down, cut them up, serve them that day. But in some of these all-you-can-eat places, they'll freeze them, thaw them out, cut them up, sometimes freeze them again, and it's just the quality just goes to hell. And the other thing, it's not just it's the time temperature abuse, cold, warm, cold, that's bad. But the other thing is it gets freezer burn, where the freezer starts to break down the product, and then you have fish that's just like falling apart.
So that's the thing. You get to a situation where somebody today may have a familiarity with a lot of different kinds of cuisines, but as we discussed, the quality of how the food is prepared, the ingredients from where they are, the actual process that it's prepared in, the people making the food might not be that knowledgeable in the processes and understanding of it, which you normally get when you go to one of these higher end restaurants. So somebody may be aware of more cuisines and think they know more about the food, yet you have somebody who has spent years and years focusing on one cuisine. They actually get to know what that actual cuisine is. So now, how do you get to a situation where, do you think there's ever a situation where you can convince people that yes, somebody should take this much time to actually learn any one particular cuisine or anything in depth when you have this access to such low level or shallow access to so many different kinds of things?
See, I don't know, because one of the things I've said, I've been saying this a lot about academics since I got more interested in this stuff, is that like there's sort of this, certain academics, not all obviously, but some of them kind of have this ego where they know a lot in one area and they think because of that they know a lot about everything, but when then they talk about other subjects, it's like they just fall off a cliff mentally. But I think there's sort of that ego of like, well, I know a lot about that and it's sophisticated, therefore I know a lot about everything. And I've seen this with sommeliers too, where a lot of sommeliers, not all, but some of them like haven't worked in a kitchen, but they know a lot about wine and that's a sophisticated thing. So they assume, well, I know a lot about wine, I know a lot about food too. And then when you talk to them about food, you find out they have no idea. But I think it's just, I think it just takes a certain degree. It's just self-discipline. You would just have to re-examine what you know. You have to keep challenging yourself and so on. Like, for example, I found this stuff with like learning philosophy is like read different philosophers, read competing philosophers, see how their views compete, weigh them in my head, read the more advanced material, just keep challenging myself. That way it's like, I know I'm developing, don't think, oh, I'm great because I know this. It's like, I think you have to set that higher bar for yourself, but I don't know, I think for some people they just don't want to do that. It's like they'd rather just be comfortable, oh, I know a lot about this, therefore I'm smart, rather than, okay, I know this about Nietzsche, I know this about Kierkegaard, but this is only a surface view. Let me look further into it. Okay, I've learned this, but there's more to learn. I think there has to be that drive to keep pushing onward. It's the same thing with the chefs. Like Joël Robuchon, he's considered by a lot of people to be the best in the world. He is one of the French masters. His philosophy is interesting because it's striving for perfection, but at the same time believing perfection is unattainable, which is kind of interesting. But it's that whole, no matter how good I put it out, it's never good enough. But it's also like that's how he got to that level. It's like always, how do you strive for that next level? And I think people as individuals, myself included, just have to keep doing that. It's like there can't be somebody, you can't get complacent. Oh yeah, I'm good at this, or I know this, therefore I'm done. There's what's that next level?
Yeah, that's interesting to see, because also you see this in many different fields. I think like in the artistic field, there's a situation where, I forget who said this. It was not Rembrandt. It was some really good artist. I remember getting this note. They said that somebody asked him, how does he know when a piece is finished? And he said, okay, I don't know when it's finished. I know when it's good enough. He knows when it's gotten to the point where it's enough to express the image that he had in mind, yet it's not necessarily, it could still use work, but it's gotten to that point. So, that good enough point. I like to think about that in the sense of how do you figure out if a food is not good enough, but expressive enough to be a cuisine? When does something change from just being food to being cuisine, or when does something, like, I'm thinking about this in that sense, like as we had mentioned in the previous video towards the end, was American cuisine. What is something that's American cuisine? You know, something like, for example, as I mentioned with General Tso's chicken, that was invented in America.
Yeah.
But it was invented within Chinese food. It was invented by, I think there was a story. I'll probably leave a link to how that was invented. But with that guy, if he invented it here in America, is it American cuisine?
Well, I remember learning about this in school because we actually took a class called Cuisines of the Americas, and we talked about different areas and how they were influenced. And I loved learning about New Orleans, Louisiana. I thought that was really interesting because Acadian, Cajun is a bastardization of Acadian. Acadians were people who came down from Canada and settled there. So that's where you see the French influence. That's where you see étouffée. That's where you see beignets, all that. But then with Creole was the word for a Spanish person born in the New World. They were ethnically Spanish by blood, but they were born in the New World. Mm-hmm. But then Creole, you see things like jambalaya, which is based off paella, but without saffron and with local shellfish. So it kind of became its own thing, and then it's like, okay, you can see where it came from, but then it's like it's become another dish based on what's around and based on the taste of the people and so on. And one of my friends, I remember him remarking, like, could it be said that there is no real American cuisine? It's like, yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. I mean, it's like, where do you categorize? I mean, Yankee pot roast, that was British originally. Of course, pizza, there's a whole debate about, there's Princess Margarita in Sicily, but then there was also the Greeks, they say they had a role in that too. And, it's debated, like, where did this stuff really begin? The French say they invented chowder, but then it's like, come on, people living by the ocean didn't figure out to,
French invented everything.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But, but then it's like, okay, well, to be chowder, it has to have pork product, seafood, potatoes, and dairy. And then it's like, okay, well, now it's officially a chowder. But then it's like, now you see things like corn chowder and whatever, and obviously that doesn't contain those. Yeah. So, it's like, where do you draw that line?
Yeah, so,
Or, spaghetti and meatballs, that's considered an entree. But, of course, as you know, having lived in Italy, you eat your pasta before the meal. So it's things like that. But then you could say that's Italian-American. It's not Italian-Italian.
Yeah. So Italian-American, when does it become American-American? Because I think, try to see the connections and the interesting things about this. Because you see this now when it comes to immigration, when it comes to people moving around the world. They say, okay, when does this person become of that country?
Yeah.
For example, like with me, my parents are Kenyan, technically Kenyan by citizenship, but I've lived in different countries in the world.
Right.
I know people that have lived in Kenya longer than I have. Like, I remember going back to visit and had a neighbor there. He was, I think, from the Czech Republic or something. But he'd moved to Kenya. He'd been living in Kenya for, I think, about 7 years at the time when I got there.
Right.
And he'd started a business. He moved there with his wife. They ended up having a kid before I left. But he was there in his adult formative years that he decided to be there and make a living there.
Sure.
So technically they're considering me more Kenyan than him, even though I just came from Europe to visit it. So what does make that food, or what does it, I think the same things that would make a food of that place would make a person of that place in a way. I'm not quite sure if I'm putting it in the correct way. Because if you can understand that, you can say, okay, this food had influence on this and this, so it's still / American, where it's like you say, Italian American or Chinese American. When does it become just American?
Well, that's a challenge, and I think I may have mentioned this in the last video, but I have Austrian heritage. My last name is Austrian. The Wiener Schnitzel was actually stolen from the Italians because when they ruled over that part of Milan, they saw them doing it, and then they took it back to Vienna, and they're like, okay, well now it's Wiener Schnitzel or Viennese cutlet in German, and then it's like, okay, is it really? It's not an originally Austrian dish. They stole it from the Italians, but at the same time, it's like, you go to Austria, that's considered, one of the national dishes. So it's like, how do you draw that line either? And those are two old world countries. It's not like the U.S. where you have all these people from wherever. I have multi-European backgrounds too. So, but then if you look in like traditional German, Austrian cooking, it tends to be the meat's either seared or they have sausages or so on. That breading and frying isn't too common, but they like that technique. So like, why don't we embrace it too? Austria is big on coffee. Well, that was left behind by the Turks. When the Turks fought them, they left it behind. And, Austria is, well known for coffee houses and whatever now, but of course it's not native to Austria at all. So I mean, I think everything to a certain extent came from somewhere else. It's like it's very hard to trace everything exactly back to, because there's all that stuff with the DNA test now where people think, oh, this is my background, and they find out, oh, I have some sub-Saharan African, oh, I have some Ashkenazi Jew, all that, but it's like, somebody mixed in somewhere along the line, and you don't know exactly where, and so, and I think with food, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, this dish was stolen from these people, and then these people tried to take credit for it, and so on, but it's like, it's hard to know exactly where the point of divergence is.
Yeah. Because, and even with that whole 23andMe thing, the DNA test, that person who's mixing in you, did that person come in as a whole or a full, let's say it's an Ashkenazi Jew, if you find that, was that percentage in there brought by somebody who was like, okay, this person was one race and married an Ashkenazi Jew, and then that's how it got in? Or was that Jewish DNA brought in by somebody who was mixed themselves with a lot of different things?
Yeah.
So you don't even know where these things are coming from. So
illegitimate children and all that. Yeah.
So there's a tough kind of thing to deal with, like finding where things originate, how things are still going to be that thing, how are those things going to go forward? Because I think especially when you're talking about automation, when you're talking about some of these things with food, they say, okay, you're taking away what the food is. They say, okay, if it's not.
But the thing is, it's like that gets back to the whole point about like where does it come from, whatever, and what's the big deal. It's like most things came from somewhere else anyway. That's the whole cultural appropriation thing where it's like, it's like you can complain about like hairstyles, whatever. It's like, okay, are you going to stop using windows because your country didn't invent them? Are you going to stop using, navigational technology because I was Chinese? It's like, where do you draw the line on all that stuff? It's like, it's just like, to me, it's the best ideas should go forward, the ones that have the best results, and so on. Because otherwise, it's like, if you're trying to be a purist, like a lot of people will ask me, like, what's your favorite kind of food? And I don't like to pigeonhole myself, because reality is, I like Japanese, obviously, I like Vietnamese a lot, I like French, it's like, and it's like all those vary, and it's like I can't pigeon myself into this one category where, I only like this, because again, they probably took from other places too.
Yes,
so
because that's the thing. Do you really like Vietnamese? Is that Vietnamese? Like, for example,
the French influence. I mean, they have like crêpe Indochine, which is that's, you can tell it's French. The banh mi, that's on a baguette. That's the French bread. It's like they serve pâté on it. That's also French. So it's like it was a French colony. So it's like but it's considered a Vietnamese dish, like it's sort of like my schnitzel example. So it's like, where do you draw that line? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's an odd thing you see in a place like Kenya with 42 different tribes. The tribes didn't develop their own official cuisines. I think not anywhere close to any level that they have in places like Asia and the West and Europe, where they had more of a written tradition and a more formed tradition, where they said, okay, this was a food that was writing down recipes and knowing. And it was still passed down just through speaking, through the way it's taught. And actually, there's not even that much spices when you go to the countryside, whether it's just not access to having that or not having
they don't grow there
to where they had that. So maybe chili peppers, that'd be pretty much it. But I don't really recall them being like stores and things like that of spices. And just randomly related things, spices were so important. There was wars. There's definitely been massive worldwide wars over spices.
Yeah.
But coming back to what I was saying, you have a country like Kenya, which is now in Nairobi, they're now developing Kenyan cuisine. There's Kenyan restaurants where when you go there, there's foods taken from different regions, but something like chapati, which is brought in by the Indians, by the British coming in. So now check this influence out. The British come in to colonize the country. They bring in people from India there. People from India settle in Nairobi. They start creating chapati, mandazi, some of these things, some of these foods that they bring from there. Roti was kind of the thing that they brought there. Definitely a lot of the use of the spices, that has been added there by them. And then now when Kenyan cuisine starts being developed, when you go to a restaurant and you find, okay, this is a Kenyan cuisine restaurant. I think there's one restaurant in the DC area, if I'm not quite sure, might be wrong about this, but somebody started a restaurant there, but a typical thing to have in a Kenyan cuisine restaurant is chapati. And chapati was definitely brought by the Indians. And now the Indians didn't even come by themselves, they were brought over by colonization. So it gets to a point where something that is considered part of Kenyan food, Kenyan culture. There's people now who are like, yes, Kenyan food is, I really like chapati, it's a Kenyan food. They might not understand the history of how it came to be. That same person might be completely against colonization, saying nothing good came out of colonization, while sitting there enjoying this food they consider to be Kenyan, even though it was like a double colonization effect of British colonizing India and then moving it here.
An example that just occurred to me is the British and tea. Like, the British are always famous for tea time or whatever, but it's like tea's not native to Britain. It doesn't grow in Britain. It was either India or the Indies or. But I think it probably grows in the Caribbean.
Or even Kenya. Kenya is one of the world's biggest tea and coffee production things. And
coffee's famous. Yeah.
An odd thing, like Java House is one of these coffee houses that's moved there, and it's kind of like in the same Starbucks type Americanized coffee place. That same coffee thing, I think it was a thing where I think Starbucks finally opened in Italy, but I think somebody had traveled to Europe and had seen in Austria and Italy and seen these coffee houses, and then decided to copy that kind of system to bring it to America and Americanize it. So you have a situation where that happens. Now that's occurred, and then now Java House, which is a South African coffee chain that copied kind of the Starbucks
model,
the Starbucks model, has now moved to Kenya, and that's a major one there. Now you have a lot of Kenyans going to Java House, going there and enjoying that, and you'll find that both the coffees and the teas that you find in those Java Houses places, the ones you find in the stores, some of them, these high-end ones, will be companies that have bought coffee and tea from the Kericho area, from the farms and the plantations in Kenya, shipped it to another country, packaged it, and then shipped it back into Kenya and selling it as the high-end stuff. There are local companies coming, but at the same point, they're competing with their own product being shipped out and then shipped back in.
Oh, that's interesting.
From international companies.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you see this a bit too. I think I might have touched on this briefly last time, but the whole thing with like the sugar industry, how the corn industry lobbied to keep foreign sugar out because it's cheaper, so then they make corn syrup instead, and then you have corn syrup and everything, which is horrible for you, high fructose corn syrup especially. But the irony of like if they remove the tariffs, you could get sugar from the Caribbean, it would probably be cheaper and not as bad for you. But it's like because of that interest controlling it, they want to stifle that.
Mm-hmm. So that's an odd thing. I mean, I think whenever you start diving into any topic, this is one thing I suggest to people. If you find something enjoyable, don't just stay at the surface level. Even if it's something like McDonald's, if you really like McDonald's just by itself, look into the process of how McDonald's comes to be, how the process is. Little pro tip, I went to McDonald's the other day and was with a friend, and he said you have to order fresh. If you like the McChicken, which I think is one of the go-to things, it's just a basic one.
Yeah.
The smaller burger, just bread,
the
bun, lettuce, I think some mayonnaise, and then the patty, the chicken patty. Ask for a fresh one, and apparently they give you the one that's taken right out of the freezer, because normally they take them out of the freezer, thaw them, and then deep fry them. If you ask for fresh, directly out of the freezer, it's crispier apparently. I tried it, I couldn't really tell the difference that much, but my friend swore by it. Want to share that with you guys if you guys want to try it out. But as I said, my food palate might not be the best. But just the conversations we're having here, I think a part of why I really wanted to have these conversations was just looking into different fields, and you can see the different connections that you have whenever you delve deeper into pretty much any topic.
Yeah.
It's really a shame when we have the access to all this information that people really stay at a shallow level, at a base level of things when you have all this depth and all this ability to do it. So it's not necessarily I'm saying you have to learn about every single topic. I like philosophy. I'm not saying you have to really delve deep into that. But if you like something, why not take some time and delve deep into it?
Yeah.
Next time you're sitting on the line of McDonald's, why don't you sit there and actually try to understand how the company works, how what the food you're eating is coming from, and etc.
And like I said, keep pushing yourself to learn more too. Don't just say, "Oh, I know something, now I'm an expert." Keep pushing,
Yeah.
Like I was saying earlier too, with philosophers, like don't read a little bit and think, wow, I'm an expert on this now. No, there's always something to learn. There are people that know more than you do. You can cook a few dishes. You're not a master chef. The odds are there are people way better, unless you're Robuchon or Keller or somebody. So it's just like keep pushing for that next level. I think that's a big thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've touched on some automation, we've touched on some culture. There was a conversation I had recently where I really wanted to flesh this out more. It was just the process of how the relation between why certain cultures develop certain foods. Like as we discussed, the French were saying they invented chowder, and then you were saying, but there's other cultures that lived by the ocean that were eating similar foods. So there's definitely a chance that other cultures did things concurrently.
Right.
Where you might come up with an idea, but somebody across the world is also coming up with a similar idea for either the same reasons or disparate reasons, but you can reach the same kind of conclusions in different ways.
Right.
So I didn't think there is a connection to how certain cultures develop, because food is a central thing that we've had. I think even the Lassalle paintings, which is the first proof of art where they were painting the animals on the walls,
cave paintings,
in France. See, France invented everything. but that aspect, why were they painting animals? Why were they painting these things? Because that was their familiar area. That was, I think, the foods that they were eating. You had to be familiar with these things. So I think if you can understand why certain cultures eat certain foods, both the process of obtaining that food, storing that food, cooking that food, I think that plays a part in how that culture is actually developed.
Well, like there's the whole thing, like why do they call British people limeys? Because they were the ones who ate limes at sea to avoid scurvy. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't fully understood at the time, but of course later, vitamin C prevents that. But because they would snack on limes, and they said apparently I guess way back when you'd go to these British docks, these even American docks, and you'd find discarded limes just laying around, because that was the sailors eating that. They didn't fully understand the science, but they knew there was some connection. I don't know the details of that, but I know that someone figured out there was a connection between those things.
Another good one is just the different theory that people have about the cultures that had to deal with winter or certain climate issues where they had different access for food. They had to think, okay, there's going to be 3 to 6 months of the year where we don't really have relatively direct access to food, so we have to think in a certain way, and that selects genetically for a different kind of mentality, a different kind of body type, a different kind of person who can actually think in the future, and okay, we have to store this seed crop and things like that. And I think if you can find how certain things developed, and I think food is a good thing to talk about because that's something everybody is familiar with. We all eat, we all like this stuff. So if you start seeing some of these patterns in the foods, see how foods came to be, see how food is treated, see how, for example, saying we shouldn't know more about food, let's let the government, or let's let the state, let's let another external body decide what foods we eat and make those decisions for us. Yeah. See the effect that it has on society, on yourself.
Well, it's the appeal to authority fallacy. Yes. That's basically what it is. It's just for those that don't know, it's basically where if you instead of thinking for yourself, you defer to someone else. Like the example Ben Shapiro made, which I thought was a very good analogy. I don't know what everyone's religious views are here, but for me, I'm an agnostic, and he was saying how Shapiro's Jewish, but he was saying how a lot of Christians, religious Christians, will cite the Bible as their point of reference. But the problem with that is if you're talking to an agnostic or an atheist, they're going to say, well, I don't follow that source. What do I care what it says? So if you want to make the case for something is wrong, you have to defend it on logical and moral grounds. Otherwise, it's just you appealing to your authority, and then an atheist can cite Richard Dawkins or Peter Boghossian or somebody, and then a Christian can say, well, I don't like them because I don't believe in God, and then it's just you two deferring to each other's authorities rather than let's actually hash out the arguments and see who can make the better case.
Yeah.
There's a whole thing the sugar industry, with the corn industry lobbying to downplay the negative effects of corn syrup, and then of course the meat industry, same thing, trying to downplay, of course the effects of meat health, all the too much meat in your diet, the hormones used, all that. So it's but if you say, oh, well, they produce it, they're running things, they know what they're talking about, it's well, but that assumes no bias, no agenda, no mistakes, and it's you can't say that about anybody.
Yeah. All right, so I think we'll call it the conversation for this one.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Got about an hour. So we'll be back for another part of this. I'm not quite sure what exactly we'll discuss in this next one, but I think extend on the cultural aspect, on the thoughts aspect. If we develop another idea between then, I don't know. Can you think of anything?
Not off the top of my head, but I'll think about it.
Okay. So there'll definitely be links. I think the Anthony Bourdain thing, the story about Joe and So's chicken. We'll go through this and think if there was any other interesting links that we can leave. So there'll be links in the low bar.
Sure.
And last word?
No, I think I'm good. I think we covered everything that we wanted to.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening. And until next time, like, share, and subscribe. And bye.
Bye. See you soon.